done with my
Well,
second shot, so I'm doing well.
I got you. Well, I know we're gonna keep tonight. Brother Rogers, I know he didn't have a presentation tonight. We're gonna keep things very short tonight. As far as the process now, questions and any all that, those are still welcome. And I'm gonna turn it over to you, brother.
Well, I appreciate it. Uh, I don't know if I'm on, but
Yes, sir. You are.
okay. I was going to talk tonight about what I believe is one of the most interesting and historic lodges in Louisiana, and actually probably the world. And the interesting aspect that has always hit me about this lodge is of information that simply doesn't exist or
Oh,
has
there it goes.
existed
Okay.
in a limited area. And what
See,
I'd like to talk. Okay. Am I on?
Tell you what, everybody mute their phones. Mute your phones, brother Little John.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, mute your phone.
Yeah, I'm working on it right now. Please remember to keep your phone muted.
Okay. Well, I'll start off with, first off, Etoile Polaire is French for polar star. And in what I'll be speaking about, and in some of the documents you'll see both. You'll see Etoile Polaire and polar star. And sometimes there's confusion as to what the name is, but it's polar star in English, Etoile Polaire if you use it in French. Most of the time they say Etoile Polaire today, but historically it's been both. So wanted to get that part off. And the other part is that I am not an attorney. And there's going to be a part we could talk about some legal aspects. Keep that in mind. I am not an attorney, and I'll clarify some things as we get to it. But from what we know, Etoile Polaire began an organization date in 1794. A lot of the records that we have and a lot of the information that we have from that early time is actually oral traditions. And there's talk about that maybe it was organized earlier. Perfect Union was organized in 1793, and it received its charter from the Grand Lodge of South Carolina in 1794. And there's always been talk about who is actually the oldest. And I've also heard information and reports about Perseverance Lodge actually being older than both of them. It doesn't really matter, and from a historical standpoint, it's not that important. The thing that was important is that these two lodges were created around the time that they did. And what I found absent and missing from most historical accounts is one aspect of their creation, of both of these lodges' creation, and that is the time that they were created. If you think back, anybody who's older than 35, 40 years old is going to remember the 1990s, and they're going to remember things that happened back then. They're going to remember things like, the Berlin Wall came down, Germany was unified, became one country again. The Soviet Union collapsed, and the Russian Federation took over again. We had the Desert Storm in Iraq. We remember these things, and these were things that were taking place on the other side of the world. The same amount of time, this 30-year period, these Masons in New Orleans certainly remembered 30 years prior to their joining Masonry, or when these two lodges were created. They remember 30 years prior, and what they clearly would have remembered was what happened to those early lodges in the 1750s. You see, the earliest lodge that we know of now was created in 1752, and Masonry in New Orleans started seeing like there was some activity. And they had several lodges that were created, and by the 1760s, a dramatic change took place, which we've talked about in other lectures, and that was that Spain took control of the Louisiana territory, and they basically came down like a hammer on New Orleans, and they had a completely different management style than the French did. And one of the unique things about Spain was that Freemasonry was outlawed. And the worshipful master of that original 1752 lodge, Trapani, they issued arrest warrants for all the Masons. Well, the soldiers came to his house, busted the door down, and when he resisted a little bit, they bayoneted him to death in his home. Several of the other officers were arrested, and they were sent to prisons in Cuba. Really bad conditions. And the entire city basically was, what happened to Masonry, we're not really sure, because everything was shut down. And either they ceased to exist, went underground, or whatever. But it was a difficult time for Freemasonry. And we have to understand, when these two lodges were created in the 1790s, Spain was still in control of the entire Louisiana territory. So while they may have backed off some and not been as active in persecuting or arresting Freemasons or their whole position on it, we have to understand that what the members of these two lodges did was pretty courageous, and they had to be committed to Freemasonry. And what we see with Etoile Polaire is that when they were created, oral tradition also tells us that there was some sort of conflict between Etoile Polaire and Perfect Union, supposedly created a year earlier. Whatever conflicts they were, I personally believe that they had to do with the future goals of these two lodges and Freemasonry in Louisiana. And when I say that, what I'm talking about is Etoile Polaire, when they organized, rather than following the pattern of Perfect Union and applying to a U.S. Grand Lodge, they sent someone to France, and their goal was to obtain a charter from France. Now, again, there's conflicting reports as to where they were going. I've read some reports where the brother who carried the request for the charter to France was belonging to a lodge under the jurisdiction of the Grand Lodge of France, the old Grand Lodge of France. Another reports say that they knew that the Grand Lodge of France had ceased to exist, and they were going to the Grand Orient of France. Well, in either case, the brother wasn't successful, because the Grand Lodge of France had broken apart, and the Grand Orient of France had suspended its labors. So when the guy got there was no Grand Lodge or Grand Orient for them to receive a charter from. So what he did was he got a provisional charter, which is like a temporary charter or a permit, from a lodge which was a Perfect Serenity. And I believe that they were more or less acting in the same capacity as the Provincial Grand Lodge. So he came back with that several years later. And the Grand Orient finally did come back into work and issued a charter in 1804. Now, a lot had happened during this time. When the Spanish were backing off, and in 1803, Spain reverted the entire territory back to France. And almost immediately, France turned around and sold the Louisiana territory to the United States. And when they did that, things started changing dramatically. Now, France had no problem with Freemasonry. The United States certainly had no problem with Freemasonry. So there was a general development and building up of Freemasonry in the New Orleans area, and really all in the whole area. What started happening was it's pretty clear that they started to realize that eventually this was going to become part of the United States. And we see several lodges developing in the New Orleans area. And by 1811, the Grand Consistory of Louisiana had already been created, and Masonry was getting itself organized in the city. And an interesting thing happened. Etoile Polaire had been under the jurisdiction of the Grand Lodge of Grand Orient of France for about 10 or so years, 10, 11 years. And then all of a sudden, in 1811, they petitioned the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania and received a charter from the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania. When they did that, there was an announcement made. There was going to be a convention of lodges, and they were inviting the 7, and the way they phrased it I found interesting, the 7 regular lodges in the New Orleans area to take part in this convention with the goal of forming a Grand Lodge. They obviously knew that statehood was close, and they, for some reason, they felt the need to qualify regular lodges. Well, I said, well, what other lodges were in the area at that time that they may not have considered regular, and why would they not consider them regular? Well, the only other lodge that I could find in the New Orleans area around that time was the 1807 lodge that was created by a 33rd from the Supreme Council of Kingston, Jamaica. That was actually the first actual Scottish Rite, the 33-degree system lodge that was created in New Orleans, La Benefice. And when I was checking that, the same 33rds who created that lodge in 1809 created a Lodge of Perfection, then 1811 created a Grand Consistory. And most everyone in the Grand Lodge was involved in this Lodge of Perfection and certainly the Grand Consistory. So I was wondering, why would they consider this lodge not regular? And it dawned on me when I started to see the Grand Lodge when they were organized. Now, I don't have there's not many early proceedings of the Grand Lodge of Louisiana that's around, but I have one. Let's see if I can pull it up. This is from 1820. This is a proceeding from the Grand Lodge of Louisiana, and it gives a list of the lodges. Now, it shows Perfect Union as lodge number 1, Charity as number 2, Concord Lodge number 3, Perseverance as number 4, and Etoile Polaire, Polar Star, as number 5.
Oh, yeah.
Now, when I see this, I have to wonder, say, well, why was Etoile Polaire given the number 5 in the very early days? Because it's known today as number 1. And we'll talk about how it got to be number 1 in a second. But the question would be, why did they get number 5? They should have been number 2 if they're going by age. And it had dawned on me that what they seem to have been wanting to do, this early Grand Lodge, the early Masons, they wanted to be part of the United States. And it seems like pressure had been put on Etoile Polaire in the very early days to take a charter from a U.S. Grand Lodge. All of these other 3 lodges held charters from the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania. And they were created in the early 1800s. Etoile Polaire waited until just a few months before they actually had this committee to get its charter from Pennsylvania. And I believe they kept La Benefice Lodge out, the actual Scottish Rite Lodge, out because they would not get a charter from a U.S. Grand Lodge. They wanted to maintain their charter with Supreme Council in Kingston, Jamaica. And for that reason, and I would imagine that if Etoile Polaire had decided, no, we're not going to take a charter with the U.S. Grand Lodge, they would have left them out. But as it is, they held the youngest charter from a U.S. Grand Lodge, who had pushed them to number 5 in the rankings. And I found it interesting that they would take this position, but it made sense in the sense that they were looking to be part of the United States and the Masonic community, and they wanted to keep everything inside. Now, this 1807 lodge, La Benefice Lodge, it soon merged with one of these 5 lodges, and it wasn't Etoile Polaire, believe it or not, it was Perfect Union. And today, a lot of people, when I first joined Masonry, it was if you defined Etoile Polaire, it was the oldest Scottish Rite Lodge. Perfect Union was the oldest York Rite Lodge. That's true today, but apparently when they were created, they were pretty much all working the same rituals, and it wasn't a matter. But what started happening, as we've mentioned in several earlier lectures, there was a lot of English-speaking Masons coming into New Orleans, and they were very unhappy with what they were seeing in the city as far as non-English speaking lodges. They ended up being like 5 different languages being spoken and numerous different rituals. So they were having a problem with this. The Grand Lodge itself was operating pretty much hands-off from local lodges. They didn't really get involved with the local lodges on day-to-day business. They were there for the big picture. And problems started developing. And there were 2 events that took place in the late 1820s and early 1830s that made the Grand Lodge rethink some of its positions. One of them was the Grand Consistory of Louisiana. They had been bouncing from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Cyrano died. They weren't sure who to go to, so they went to the southern jurisdiction. They ended up dying. We talked about last time, this was in the early 1830s. And they went under the United Supreme Council of Western Hemisphere. They weren't long for around. But what they did was they seemed to have, from some of the minutes books we have, they changed the name from the Grand Consistory of Louisiana to the Sovereign Grand Consistory of Louisiana. And that's always been an interesting phrase, because we're not sure exactly what they meant. We didn't know if they were themselves acting as a Supreme Council or exactly what the thought was. But they chartered several lodges during this time, and the Grand Lodge was not happy about it. And the Grand Lodge, they contacted the Grand Consistory, and there's very amazing events that took place. The commander-in-chief of the Grand Consistory of Louisiana announced that this was within their full rights to do this. And the Grand Lodge says, well, we're not happy about this. So they decided to negotiate, and they reached an agreement. And what the agreement was that the Grand Lodge would provide for the different types of ritual, Scottish Rite, York Rite, and French or Modern Rite. And the Grand Consistory would not charter lodges. And what's so amazing about this negotiation is that the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Louisiana was John Holland, and he ended up serving more times than anyone else as Grand Master. And the commander-in-chief of the Grand Consistory of Louisiana was a 33rd. He ended up taking part in the creation of the Supreme Council of Louisiana in 1839, and he was a real mover and shaker. His name was John Holland. It was the same guy who was Grand Master and Commander-in-Chief. So I would have loved to have been in those negotiations to see how they worked. But he was the same individual, and while wearing the Commander-in-Chief hat, he created these lodges, and while wearing the Grand Master's hat, he objected to it. So it was truly an amazing time. But in addition to that, there was a conflict between 2 lodges, where 2 lodges, one was English-speaking York Rite, the other was French-speaking French Abandonite Lodge. And the disagreements between these two lodges reached a part of hostility. And it got so bad that what they decided to do was to, by lodge resolution, break fraternal relations with each other. Well, the Grand Lodge had to step in. And the Grand Lodge says, no, you're both under our jurisdiction. You can't break relations with each other. And they somewhat smoothed over the issue, but they realized between this issue and the issue with the Grand Consistory that they had to do something in order to settle some of the problems. And what they ended up doing was they created a chamber. It was a committee with 3 subcommittees, and it was a ritual supervisory committee that they called the Chamber of Rites. And it had one subcommittee for the York Rite ritual, one for the Scottish Rite ritual, and one for the French Abandonite ritual. And the idea was if they would give the lodges the option to choose whatever they wanted to work in. If they wanted to work in the Scottish Rite, they would could work in a Scottish Rite ritual. They would even give them a Scottish Rite charter, or they would give a French Abandonite charter or a York Rite charter. Etoile Polaire, as usual, they were amazing in what they did. And let's see if I can pull this up. Okay, this is the 1833 proceedings from the Grand Lodge of Louisiana. And if we go to the next page, this is the York Rite. There you see Etoile Polaire number 5, Pierre Soule. This was the York Rite ritual. But all of a sudden, now I'll say Scotch Rite. Scotch was high, that's a marker for New Orleans. They did not say Scottish Rite in the very early days when they would translate to English. It was always Scotch Rite. And if you see that written anywhere, you know it came from New Orleans. But there's Etoile Polaire number 1 for the first time, Scottish Rite. Down in the French Rite, you see Etoile Polaire number 1, and each one has a different worshipful master. Then if you look on this side of the page, they have the meeting days. Etoile Polaire number 5, York Rite, met the first Sunday of every month. Etoile Polaire number 1, Scottish Rite, met the second Sunday of every month. Etoile Polaire number 1, French Abandonite Rite, met the third Sunday of every month. That Etoile Polaire split itself into 3 separate lodges with 3 sets of officers. And this is one of the most amazing things. I've never seen what happened. And when this proceeding came out, the problem that we have is right following this, we enter the Dark Ages as far as Masonic records for the Grand Lodge, because there are no proceedings from 1833 until 1845 when it comes back. What happened? We don't know. What did these lodges do? How did they remain like that? We simply don't know. All we know is that the 1845 ritual that came out was the next one that we'll be able to find anywhere. And the York Rite, Etoile Polaire is not on there. The only place it shows up is Scottish Rite. They work in the Scottish Rite ritual. Etoile Polaire, Polar Star number 1, not in the French Rite. So what happened? Don't know. Now, there was also another interesting situation that developed during this time. We don't know what happened between 1834 and 1844. We don't know why Etoile Polaire switched from 3 separate lodge offices to 1. Maybe they decided it wasn't working. Maybe the Grand Lodge rewrote petition resolutions. We have no clear information as to what happened. However, records show that the Grand Lodge in 1844, right before this proceedings that I showed you, they made some changes, and they had a Grand Lodge constitution, a new constitution that was written, that the York Rite English-speaking Masons went crazy about, raged about. And what was said in those constitutions is basically the same thing that was said in 1833 or 1832 constitutions. It was that the lodges would work in whatever ritual they chose. They would have whatever charter they chose. It was the same thing, but this 1844 Constitution, for some reason, infuriated them to the point where they felt that they needed to go to the Grand Lodge of Mississippi and say that the Grand Lodge of Louisiana no longer has a legitimate Grand Lodge. Now, there's a lot of reasons why Mississippi was the place to go, and it has to do with Scottish Rite events happening, which there'd be another time for that. But what happened was the Grand Lodge of Mississippi deliberated, and they ended up by saying Louisiana is open territory, and they chartered 7 lodges in and around the city of New Orleans. And these were all York Rite lodges. And these 7 lodges the following year, 1848, created their own Grand Lodge, which was the Louisiana Grand Lodge of ancient York Rite Masons. Now, the Grand Lodge of Louisiana, something happened during the 1830s to early 1840s, because they this event seemed to buckle their knees. Now, they broke relations with the Grand Lodge of Mississippi, declared this self-created Grand Lodge completely irregular, but it seemed like what they were trying to do was not working. And what they ended up deciding to do was negotiate. And they wanted to negotiate with this Grand Lodge to see if they could reach some sort of agreement. Well, those negotiations turned into an offer to merge the 2 Grand Lodges by 1850. In 1850, the merger took place, except it wasn't a merger. It was a takeover. The York Rite Grand Lodge, or the new Grand Lodge, pretty much threw away everything and said, no, the lodges under the Grand Lodge of Louisiana will be English speaking. They will have York Rite ritual, and that's it. Well, the French speaking Masons, mainly in the New Orleans area, some in Baton Rouge and so forth, they went crazy, and they charged trickery. 3 lodges, Etoile Polaire, a Spanish-speaking lodge, Los Amigos del Orden, which is today Chavantes, and Disciples of Masonic Senate, which was actually a French-speaking French Rite lodge, petitioned the Supreme Council of Louisiana if they could pass under their jurisdiction. And they charged that the Supreme Council of Louisiana from 1839 till 1850 did not control craft lodges. They worked from the 4th degree to the 33rd, respecting the concordat of the Grand Consistory of Louisiana with the Grand Lodge of Louisiana. When these 3 lodges came to them, they had a decision to make, and they realized that the Grand Lodge had violated this concordat from the 1833. So they said, okay, we'll take you in. We can't let you just die. So the Supreme Council of Louisiana took in these 3 lodges. Well, the Grand Lodge of Louisiana was still in a state of turmoil. Things were happening right and left. The Supreme Council Southern Jurisdiction came in. The guy who was the mover and shaker of this York Rite movement was a Mason by the name of John Gedge. He had served as Grand Master of this Louisiana Grand Lodge, and then he just slid right over and became Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Louisiana. He contacted Albert Mackey and said, I want you to come to New Orleans and create a consistory, not a grand consistory, a consistory in New Orleans. Albert Mackey came. It was a big stink. It was a lot of trouble that was going on. The Masons in New Orleans at that time were at the point of rage. And it was a bad time. In reading the books from during that time, I remember initially feeling sick that Masons could be acting this way with other Masons. But the end result was that the Supreme Council of Louisiana split. Half of the Masons, there was the Southern jurisdiction asked, we'll merge with you in a concordat. Well, half of the members of the Supreme Council of Louisiana said, okay, we'll participate with you. The other half said, no, we're not going to participate with this. And that was the Concordat of 1855. When that happened, most of the members who did not want to participate walked out. And the ones that were left, they said, okay, you three lodges, you're out. And so Etoile Polaire, Los Amigos del Orden, and Disciples of Masonic Senate had nowhere to go. They went back to the Grand Lodge and said, can we rejoin you?
So,
They said, yes. And what happened was these three lodges went back to the Grand Lodge. And the following year, James Fullhouse said, hang on a second. There's been some misunderstanding. Supreme Council of Louisiana has not ceased to exist. And you three lodges, if you want to come back, you can come back. Etoile Polaire and Disciples of Masonic Senate said, yes, we'll come back. Los Amigos del Orden said, we can't handle all the back and forth. We're just going to wait here for a little while, see what happens, and we're going to wait. Well, in Louisiana is different in a lot of ways. And one of the ways it's different is with law. For the Grand Lodge, there are different levels of votes. There's times when if you vote on something, you only need a majority. 51%, you win. Other times you need 3/4. But that's Masonic law. When Etoile Polaire voted, it was the vast majority, more like 80 to 90%. There was only a handful of members who didn't want to return to the Supreme Council. The vast majority voted to merge back, go back to the Supreme Council of Louisiana. When they did that, they moved back. This was in 1857 when this happened. And events started happening quickly. There was, let's see if I can get this thing up. The lodges, the members who remained, a handful of members who remained in Polar Star, Etoile Polaire, they said, no, we're not going to leave. The rest of them said, well, do what you want. We're Etoile Polaire, we're voted, it's a legal vote. Louisiana is different in a number of ways. One of the ways is corporations. In a lot of jurisdictions I know, Masonic bodies are not allowed to incorporate. Louisiana, corporations are most every, I know under the Grand Lodge is a state corporation. I know the Supreme Council is a state corporation. Most of the lodges under the Grand Lodge of Louisiana have been state corporations. Etoile Polaire was a state corporation. Turns out, this lawsuit that you see up here, it went to the Supreme Court, the Louisiana Supreme Court, for a corporation to change jurisdictions. And this is what it's talking about. If it makes a substantial change, it's not a majority. It's not 3/4. It takes 100% of the members of a corporation to vote yes to change the district. And this is what Etoile Polaire did not do. There was a couple of members who said, no, we don't want to move. And those couple of members actually, under the law, prevented Etoile Polaire from merging. I believe, and I don't have this recorded, but I believe that this is why James Fullhouse stepped up and said, guess what? That Concordat in 1855, it's not valid. He was a district court judge. I believe he realized this corporation, because the Supreme Council was a corporation, just like Etoile Polaire. And I believe he knew that this Etoile Polaire lawsuit was going to end up exactly the way it did. But what happened was the court ruled that the members who wanted to join and go to the Supreme Council could very well do that. But the property and all of that remained with the Grand Lodge. And so this is how you ended up with two Etoile Polaire lodges, number one, both with the same heritage, but under two different jurisdictions because it's split. And what's interesting, this Supreme Council vote, everything that I've seen, the Supreme Council of Louisiana prior to the Civil War was growing powerful. They had quite a number of lodges. They were well organized. They had their Sovereign Grand Commander and their Lieutenant Grand Commander, both district court judges. So they were savvy in what was going on. And then afterwards, everything changed. Following the Civil War, pretty much everything changed. And there was a lot of political maneuvering, it seems like. And there's things that I frankly don't know about. But one of the things that I learned early on was that in 1867, James Fullhouse, for reasons that have never been explained, moved away and resigned as Grand Commander. Eugene Kashnak came in as Grand Commander. He was the secretary of Etoile Polaire, the Supreme Council at Etoile Polaire. He moved like lightning, got his 33rd, and was elected Sovereign Grand Commander. I spoke about in the late 1990s. I spoke with the great-grandson of Eugene Kashnak. His name was Charles Kashnak. He was an attorney. He worked downtown, large law office. He was amazed at the story. He didn't realize a lot of the things. He didn't know a lot of the information. He had saved a letter that Victor Hugo had sent him. This was a letter in support of the Supreme Council of Louisiana. But there was a lot of information that he was unaware of. And when I started looking at the various events, it became clear that there was much more going on. And this is actually for another time. But what was important was in 1867, Eugene Kashnak, the Supreme Council passed a resolution saying the doors of the Supreme Council will be open to any worthy men, regardless of race or religion. And what I did was, when I first heard about this, there was an English professor at UNO who had been doing studying on this. And I went to them to find out what was going on. And they had written a PhD thesis on this very subject. And they apparently had gone to the Tulane University, the Amstead Research Center, George Long papers. And they found the minutes book for Etoile Polaire. And in reading the dissertation, it tells the account. And what it says is that Eugene Kashnak stood up in Etoile Polaire Lodge and read out the resolution, and the lodge exploded in anger. And Etoile Polaire left the jurisdiction of the Supreme Council of Louisiana. Well, that told me what happened, but it didn't tell me why it happened. And so I tracked down this professor to find out the rest of the story. I said, well, what happened? And the professor told me, he said, well, it was an explosion in anger. They said it was hypocrisy. And I said, what do you mean hypocrisy? They said, well, the members of the lodge said, you're making this sound like it's something new. And if this were true, how can you explain brother so-and-so, brother so-and-so, brother so-and-so? Because they're not white. And you're making this sound like this is something new. Well, when they said this, it made me realize, because I knew that Pierre Roup was one of the notable Masons. He was a member of Perseverance Lodge. He was African American, and he was in the 1830s, 1840s. So I knew that there were several past Grand Masters that we've been doing research on that were mixed race. So I knew that there was something wrong with, and I knew the disposition of Etoile Polaire, that if they felt that they were being played with, they could very well get angry. So I said, well, that makes sense. Well, this dissertation was published in a book and released commercially. Just several weeks ago, now I've had this book for several years, the commercial copy, but I've had a dissertation since the 90s, and since I read the dissertation, I bought the commercial book, but I didn't really feel the need to read it. When I read it, just to prepare for this talk, I was shocked, because in this book, it tells a completely different story than the dissertation or what I was told personally. In the book here, it says, that Etoile Polaire exploded in rage and was outraged that they would have to take someone into their lodge who's not white. And I said, well, that's a completely different story. And from everything I saw, it said Etoile Polaire left the jurisdiction. Well, this was in 1867. So what happened to that Etoile Polaire, the Supreme Council Etoile Polaire? Well, I've never known, except when I went back and did some checking in the George Long collection. Soon as this virus thing, soon as I'm able to get out and go check, I plan on checking this. But Tulane University has the George Long papers in the Amstead Research Center. And if you look, here is the Polar Star Lodge #1 minutes book, 1858 to 1867. Well, 1858 is when they returned to the jurisdiction of the Supreme Council. 1867 was when they're supposed to leave. However, in the next box, there's another minutes book from 1867 to 1873. What is that? Did they stay with the Supreme Council longer? Did they not leave? Did none of this happen? I can't answer. What I can say is that I'm going to go check this out, because it seems to be a lot more to this story than we realize. Because how would they have 1873 minutes book if it left the jurisdiction in 1867? And still, what happened to it afterwards? Did it die? Did it come rejoin the Grand Lodge at Etoile Polaire? I have no idea. No records I've seen mention anything about what happened to it. So this is one of the other mysteries. And if there's anything that I can take away from this entire story with Etoile Polaire, it's if we look at the Haramic legend, the legend of Haram, he ran into trouble, and he stood firm. He made a decision that he was not going to compromise his honor and integrity for anything. And the result wasn't really good for him, except we all live and die, and how we live is going to determine how we're going to be remembered. And if you look at the very early Grand Lodge, the very early Etoile Polaire, one of the things that's always frustrated me is that I read about Louisiana Masonry, and I've read a number of these things from this period of time from writers from outside Louisiana, and I hear terms that the Louisiana Masons were naive. They were unsophisticated. They were not highly educated. They weren't aware of the situation. And I realized that these individuals in these early days were some of the most competent, intelligent, and courageous individuals that anybody could imagine. For them to organize these lodges at a time when there was physical death that they could have faced, and guys in their memory just 30 years earlier did die for the crime of being a Freemason. The early Louisiana Masons were bold. Something happened, and this boldness went away and was replaced for a period of time with, well, let's compromise. Let's kick it down the street. Let's worry about it tomorrow. Let's not deal with this now. And as soon as that happened, things started to fall apart. And things fell apart for the Grand Lodge. Things happened in the Grand Lodge. Things happened in the Supreme Council. James Fullhouse was the one who admitted that he made a serious mistake. He advanced the number of 33rds from 9 to 30 plus. And he says he did that to reach across the aisle to try to say, okay, you York Rite guys don't agree with us, but we're going to take you in and we're going to make you 33rds. And they did that for a number of them, and these were the ones that split. So I believe that what we can learn from the early days needs to be balanced with what time are you talking about? And I believe that there's a lot that we can learn from both periods of time. And I think what we're moving forward, we have to realize that we don't know the future any more than these guys back then did. But we know that each and every one of us is going to live until the day we die. And how we act is going to depend on how we're going to be remembered. And Etoile Polaire Lodge, from what I've seen, that is a lodge that can be remembered with a lot of respect. And maybe we have to learn what times were things happening and when we have to look the other way and change things and try to figure out what's going on for the future. So any questions? Be willing to help as much as I can, but I appreciate it.
Michael?
Yes.
Okay, so I had the ability for a while now to be able to screen share, but I wasn't sure when I should do it. So I'll go ahead and share some pictures of Etoile Polaire. And for those who don't know, I'm the current worshipful master of Etoile Polaire. And if I can find my album, I have an Etoile Polaire album. I just didn't want to interrupt your presentation. And first I can pull up a picture of the outside of the lodge. Here we go. Let's see. I think this is a good one. That's the outside of the lodge. The R, I believe, stands for respectable. We have a star at the top of the lodge. And Michael, you might know better. I know the building burned, the original one, and I believe who you talk to, you get dates between 1830 to 1850, the rebuilding, but I think 1850 is probably closer.
Yes, and the original building was behind where the current one was.
Yes. Let's see. So that's the building. Now I can show the inside of the lodge. It's very unique. I know we shared some of this before, but since this is on actually our topic.
Oh, it was a kitchen fire, by the way, too. It was a kitchen fire.
And there's the east right there. We have a red G. And I wish I had a picture further back. I don't, but leading up to there, there's 3 steps. You can see a railing on the left. There's 3 steps leading up there, and that's the east. And I got a good one of our altar. It's like every time I have to keep finding the album. All right. And we have 9 lights about the altar and a 7-sided altar. There is a Bible that goes in there, of course, a really old Bible, but you can see the polar star, the star symbol, and its square and compass there. And why is it a 7-sided altar? We have some theories. I can't say for sure we know why, but I do have some theories that I really can't talk about right now. They're basically just theories. I would also throw out, if anybody's here, Eddie Gabriel knows how to get a hold of me. Edwin knows how to get a hold of me. If any of you are in New Orleans and you'd like to see the lodge, I can make arrangements to open it up and let you tour it. Now, I'm very busy this year. If anybody follows me on Facebook, I do a lot of stuff this year. But I'm actually holding 4 major positions, just to tell you how busy. General Master of the Scottish Rite, Worship Master of Etoile Polaire, Grand High Priest of the York Rite Royal Arch, and now I'm about to be Grand Master of Odd Fellows, which I did not expect to do. They just kind of threw me in that. But there's only 4 or 5 active lodges of Odd Fellows in Louisiana, so it's not going to be that hard of a job. But I'm very busy, but I will open the lodge up to anybody that reaches out to me.
Eddie, do you have a photograph of the old Perseverance Lodge by chance?
No, but I bet I can find one on Google real quick. So why don't you keep taking questions and I can find the Perseverance picture.
Well, I'll tell you, the reason I asked was Perseverance is where the Supreme Council met. Etoile Polaire was where the Grand Consistory met in the early days, and Perseverance passed under the jurisdiction of the Supreme Council for a number of years during all the back and forth and commotion and stuff. But that old building was one of the meeting places for the Supreme Council. Actually, anyone who's from New Orleans, I don't know if you're familiar with the Pearl Restaurant right on St. Charles, a block off of Canal Street. That was another meeting place, the 2nd floor. That was when the Supreme Council, when James Fullhouse, 1857, I think they were meeting there till about 1860 or so, a few years. But the Pearl Restaurant was another meeting place of the Supreme Council. Any other questions?
Oh, I think we had Brother Larry White. I believe he had his hand raised earlier. I don't know if that was an accident or not. That may have been an accident. Are there? Do anybody have any questions concerning the presentation, or just any questions? Period.
That's Perseverance. I mean, yeah, Perseverance Lodge.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Well, brother, okay, you got Brother Schofield. He has a question.
Good evening, my brothers. I have a question for Brother Poe. You mentioned the book that this lady got her dissertation in. Would you happen to know her name and what school she attended?
I was going to try to keep her out of it, but it was Karen Cosay Bell, and it was University of New Orleans where she got her PhD. And this is so new that I've got to try to figure out what's going on, because I don't know the real story. but I got to find out. And what I want to do is go to the George Long collection. I know the dates that they're talking about, so I want to go photograph the minutes for those things and have them translated from French to English, and find out from the minutes book, because she gave very specific information about what happened. Profanity started pass. So, and all of this was supposedly written in the minutes book. So I want to not go by secondary sources. I want to go straight to the minutes book and find out what happened. That's
the reason why I asked that question is that I believe there were a female professor up at the University of Massachusetts who also did some work on it. And I was wondering whether or not this was the same person.
She could be, because she left New Orleans, I don't know when, but a number of years later, and she did move up north somewhere. I don't know. I thought it was Pennsylvania, but it could have been Massachusetts. I just don't know. But it could very well be the same person.
Okay.
Okay, you got brother Michael Chapman.
Thank you very much. Brother Paul, good to see you.
Same here.
And good to see all the wonderful brothers. I assume are from New Orleans, as you can probably tell from my accent. Not from New Orleans. I'm coming to you from New York, Shakespeare Lodge 750, Columbia Lodge 1190. I did have a question, and you'll forgive my ignorance since I'm zooming in from out of state. Does Etoile Polaire still work in French, or does that work in English?
Not since the 1950s. The last non-English speaking lodge was a Spanish-speaking lodge, Cervantes, number 5, and they switched about 10 years ago. They may be switching back. Etoile Polaire does a prayer in French. Germania does a prayer in German, and Cervantes does some work now in Spanish. They may be reverting back. Hopefully.
Okay. I'm sorry, brother. I was thinking that I was going to be able to catch out one of my local lodges. L'Union Française, number 17, contends it's the oldest French institution in the United States. And I thought, well, now Etoile Polaire is founded before 1797. Surely I've caught L'Union Française, but clearly I have not. So.
Okay, so I can chime in with Cervantes. I think like last Sunday they actually did an entire inter-apprentice ritual in Spanish from open to close.
Mm-hmm. They probably going to eventually revert totally back to Spanish, but it's to be seen. Hopefully it would.
Well, speaking again from the experience of the Grand Lodge of New York, we have an entire district in Manhattan that caters to lodges that work in the Romance languages, French, Spanish. We may even have Portuguese. I'm not terribly familiar with it other than a handful of the lodges. So if it creates an opportunity for the Grand Lodge of Louisiana, more power to it. Right now the world can only use what we have in the lodges. Brother Paul, I did also want to say this story of this back and forth between various grand bodies. Louisiana again is not alone. New York has had its own issues with schisms in Grand Lodge, and some of our oldest lodges have tales of splitting in half and sometimes remerging and sometimes not remerging. So while I hate to say it, unfortunately, what happened with Etoile Polaire is as regrettable as it might be. Unfortunately, it does happen elsewhere in Masonry. But still a fascinating history. I just wanted to give you some consolation that please don't think that Louisiana Masons are unique in behaving badly. New York Masons can behave just as badly.
Without question, and the thing that's reassuring to me and hopeful to me as a researcher, we know just a bit of the history. There's so much still to be discovered, and that's what gives me such excitement, because there's big blocks of time that we don't know anything about. And what happened there could be anything. You could, maybe maybe men from Mars came down, and who knows? It's when you have a 10, 12-year block of time, and I've checked with the Grand Lodge of New York, I've checked with most every Grand Lodge, this whole block of time, there's no proceedings anywhere for this block of time from Louisiana. And there's no doubt in my mind that it was, I hate to say this, but it was deliberately destroyed. What was in it, I can't begin to guess. But this whole block of time, there's no records that we've found yet. I do not believe it's gone completely. I believe it just needs work and trying to find more. And we'll see what happens. I'm getting older and I'm getting tired, and there's a lot of younger guys coming up, and they got the fire in them, and more people gonna start looking. And I'm a Louisiana Mason because I know there's so much here for a researcher, and it's too fascinating for me just to blow off.
Are there any more questions?
I don't have a question, but I just want to reiterate how fascinating the story you've uncovered is. I found your YouTube videos last summer, and it really is just really interesting. My day job, I teach at a college. I train teachers, history teachers, and it's went down the rabbit hole, the stuff you've uncovered. So I just want to thank you.
A young brother, he's gonna keep the research going.
One day.
Let me see, no more hands, right? Okay. Well, I want to take this time. I was always taught to give people their flowers while they're still here to smell them. And I want to take this time to give a special recognition to Most Powerful. He's been very, very, very supportive and just open-minded to providing this platform and getting this information out there so the Supreme Council can be, so it can be taught in this proper form, the history of it. And I want to say a special thank you to the Supreme Council itself for being very supportive. We always get excellent feedback from them and advice, and I want to say thank you to them. And also just to Brother Rogers and Brother Paul, y'all have done excellent jobs of telling our story and giving our history. Because I know I couldn't have did it like you guys done it. You are Masonic treasure and Masonic gold. And I just want to say thank you to you guys. Y'all have been very, very, very nice to us, and we just appreciate you guys. And I want to appreciate every other jurisdiction who joined in and supported us and shared our videos. And we just want to say thank you to all you guys for the brotherly love. And then I cannot say it more than just thank you from our hearts. And we just really appreciate you guys. We're going to go back to the drawing board and see what the next. I think we maybe have one more or two more, Brother Paul.
Whatever you want.
Yeah, I think we have two more, and we'll be having more videos coming from the council. Just one-on-one conversations with different council members, so you guys can get to know them better. We'll have more stories concerning our history. But like I said, I just want to say thank you so much. We really and greatly do appreciate everything you guys do for us. And hopefully one day we can all sit in the lives together. I mean, that's just coming from me. I don't speak on behalf of nobody. I'm just speaking from a Masonic standpoint, and we can just fellowship But to that day, we'll just keep doing it how we're doing it. I appreciate everybody once again. And I do apologize for the lack of advertising. That is solely on me. My computer broke down and I wasn't able to just advertise it like we usually do. And I do apologize. But I'll have this video up soon. And y'all guys have a great day. Sorry, I had a message across the street. But we appreciate everybody. And thank you again, Brother Paul and Brother Rogers. We're going to be looking for you to be on the next one. But you guys have a great evening. Thank you for tuning in.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, sir.
Appreciate it.